My name is Dr. Chris Jenkins, and I am the CEO of the Orianne Society and the host of the Snake Talk podcast, the podcast where you learn about nature's most feared, maligned, and persecuted animals. I invite you to listen to this conversation, and maybe you'll find that what you perceive as fear is actually rooted in a deep fascination. Welcome to the Snake Talk podcast. I am here with Dr. Rich Seigel, and we are going to have an interesting conversation today that spans an entire career working with snakes and many other species of reptiles and amphibians. I don't remember when I first met Rich, but certainly a lot of his work was very influential on me. In particular, when, as a lot of the audience knows, early on I was working primarily with amphibians, but wanted to be working with snakes, and it was some of the publications, in particular, one of the books that Rich had published that was one of those things that was something I was just digesting and kind of drove me forward to switching to a focus on snakes. And I don't know when we met, but my PhD advisor certainly worked quite a bit with Rich, and I'm assuming we first met somehow through that connection, but I can't remember exactly. But either way, welcome to the podcast, Rich. It's great to talk to you today.
It's great to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
And I like to start with all of my guests and just kind of get that origin story for how it was that they ended up getting into such what most people might think of as a kind of an eccentric or out there interest in animals like reptiles and amphibians. How did that first happen for you? Is that something happened early in life, something that kind of developed later? How did that come together?
Well, it's definitely something that developed later. I have a unusual background story, since I am, at least for my generation, not someone who was raised with herps or did anything with critters in the wild, since I was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. And the only critter that I ever saw live besides rats and pigeons was I did remember seeing tadpoles growing up in Prospect Park in New York. That was the closest encounter I ever had with a herp. And then my family moved to Newark, New Jersey, which is not a paragon of wildlife. And so I had virtually no background in dealing with live animals, keeping live animals, doing any of the things that many of my compatriots at that time did. What got me interested in science was the fact that in New York in those days, you were allowed to have a bus pass, which allowed you subway and bus access for one payment per month. And so after school, my brother and I would go to the Museum of Natural History in Manhattan, just take it on the subway in Brooklyn, get off in the basement of the Museum of Natural History, go stare at the T-Rex, go stare at the whales, go look at all the cool things that they had. And that's what really sparked my interest in science, was going to the Museum of Natural History in New York City. I didn't really know what I was going to do. I didn't have any plan specifically about being a biologist. I knew I was interested in science, and biology was fun. So I was a biology major at Rutgers University in Newark, but I was also a dual major because my parents wanted me to be an attorney. Huh. And so for the first 3 years of my career at Rutgers, I was a dual major. I was pre-law and biology. And I had two great mentors, and that was one of the really fortunate things in my career, is the number of just fantastic mentors that I had going through my academic career. And I had two of them at Rutgers. I had a fellow named James D. Anderson, who unfortunately most people won't know now since he died very young back in 1976. But he was my first instructor in ecology and conservation and wildlife and herpetology. And I took a course from him in animal ecology as a sophomore, and I loved it. But I had also had a mentor in the legal profession named Jonathan Lurie. And he was equally charismatic, and he wanted me to go to law school right there at Rutgers. And so I was being pulled in two very different directions until the second semester of my junior year, when Anderson taught a field course in biology where you went out and did weekly field trips. And I knew if I was going to do anything in science, it was going to be outdoors. I didn't want to be a lab biologist. I wanted to work outdoors. And so I told my fiance then, my wife now, that I said, if this works out, I think this is going to be the deciding factor between the law and biology. And the first day of our class in February 1975, it was a snowy day in northern New Jersey. This is when we really had winter back in 1975. It was about 8 inches of snow on the ground. Air temperature was probably about 5 C. We went out to the Watchung Mountains, which anyone who's from New Jersey will know the Watchung Mountains. It was a beautiful area. We went out stream sampling for fish and invertebrates, and we did birding. We went out wading in seeps and hunted salamanders, and I had the leaky hip boots that everybody got when you were that age. And came back at about 6 o'clock at night, about 3 hours late, freezing cold, covered in just soaking wet, freezing pants. Picked up the phone, called my fiance, and said, "The heck with the law." I had found my calling.
Yeah, a little bit of suffering.
This is what I was going to do.
Well, I'm interested about before
fantastic.
we go on that with the law. That's so, as these two majors, it seems like, and maybe I'm wrong. You can correct me on this, but doing a dual major like that, those two majors are so far apart that there would be very little overlap in, say your coursework or projects that you might work on. So it sounds like quite a workload. And then I'd also be curious. We'll get into how your career continued, but as you made that decision based on that field trip and that cold, exciting field adventure, did you ever, as you advanced through your career, did you take value or find things from your time pre-law that helped you advance within the sciences?
I think the biggest thing in not so much advancing in the science, but in, paying it back in terms of advising students, was I had so many students who would tell me that they didn't know what to do, and they felt very pressured, particularly when they got into college, that they needed to make a decision about a major, and they needed to make a decision about which direction their career would go. And I used that experience to let them know that you don't need to make up your mind this early. It's perfectly fine to be pulled in multiple directions. It's perfectly fine to have dual interests. And, as far as I go, I look back on it and said, I could have been, had a really good career for myself as an environmental attorney. I could see myself working for the Center of Biological Diversity and suing the Fish and Wildlife Service umpteen times over not listing things on the Endangered Species Act. And I could have enjoyed that. And I also got opportunities later in life to be an expert witness and testify in federal court and testify in several cases that I was proud to be involved in. And I think the legal background helped me there. But it was a tough choice. It was a very hard choice. I had, again, because of that mentorship, I had two very good career pathways that I was equally excited about. But the difference was I didn't want to wear a suit and tie, and I didn't want to work inside. So that pretty much told me what I was going to do.
Yeah. So you're an undergrad and you make this decision. And so you're assuming you kind of dive in with a lot more focus. I don't know if you continued both degrees. But, so at that point, did you have a vision for the future? Did you realize that you wanted to go on and go into academia? Or were you thinking, some other type of work, whether it be, working with state agencies or whatever it might be? But at that point, did you kind of have a vision for where you wanted to go, or did you just kind of dive in and let it take you where it may?
I dove in and was very naive about it because I knew I wanted to work in the field. And so basically after taking this course, I went to Anderson and I said, I'd like to do independent research, which in those days for an undergraduate was pretty unusual. And he sort of said, well, if we're looking for a good project to start with, how would you like to work with wood frogs? And honestly, at that point, if he had said work with pigeons, I would have been just excited. I just wanted to do something. And he suggested a project on larval mortality in wood frogs at a wonderful study site aptly named Hospital Pond. And the story of all of our students was named Hospital Pond because after you worked in Hospital Pond for a while, you wound up in the ER because you would The idea was you would go out and sample larval amphibians just as the ice was melting, which is when the wood frogs breed. And so you'd be putting your hand into 4C water and counting egg masses and doing things like that. And again, I loved it. But all I knew was I was outdoors, I was working with animals, I was doing research. I had no idea, except the most vague idea about grad school, even though we had a good graduate program. It didn't really occur to me that that was the direction to go. And it wasn't until I had a very vivid conversation with two of Anderson's graduate students. Unfortunately, he allowed the graduate students and undergraduate students to again have that sort of mentorship relationship. And we were heading up to the Great Swamp National Wildlife Refuge, which is where the study site was. And I had started to get the idea that, what these grad students were doing was really exciting because they were doing research all the time instead of just sort of fitting it in their undergraduate. And I bemoaned the fact that I didn't have the best GPA at that point, and I was worried about getting into grad school. And one of them said to me, he said, well, the worst case scenario is you'll go to grad school as a non-degree student to begin with, and then when you do well in coursework, you can convert to degree status. And the only problem is you won't get an assistantship, and you'll have to pay your own tuition. And I said, wait, stop. Assistantship? Tuition? And they said, yeah, no, as a graduate student, you'll have a teaching assistantship. They'll cover all of your tuition and they're going to pay you to go to school. I said, wait. You're going to pay me to go out in the field and catch herps. Someone is going to give me money to do that. And then they're going to give me money to go to grad school. I said, well, how come you guys haven't told me about this? And they said, oh, well, we just thought you knew. And so that was when I had just the curtain was pulled back, and I saw, wow, this is a great con. This is terrific. Someone is going to pay me to do something that I just absolutely love to do. I'm going to get a chance not only to do it, but people are going to pay me for it and give me credit for it to go to class and study this. That's when I decided, yeah, academics is definitely what I'm going to do. This is what I want to do. And then I started thinking about publishing and having grad students and teaching courses, and decided that the academic pathway was where I was going.
So did you end up staying at Rutgers then? Did you do a master's or did you go straight to a PhD? And did you just stay at Rutgers, or how did you end up moving on to the next step?
Anderson was very clear that he felt that you should go to different universities for your master's and then for your PhD. But I had reasons for wanting to stay in New Jersey, and I had a really good study site. Actually, I was working on turtle ecology at the time. I had a really nice project going on painted turtles and wood turtles and spotted turtles at the Great Swamp National Wildlife Refuge, and it was really going well. It was very publishable. And I went to Anderson and I said, can I stay here for my master's? And he looked at me for a long time. He says, okay, but just for a master's, for your PhD, you're going elsewhere. And I said, that was great. And so that was in the summer of 1976. And I had a chance to go to University of Central Florida. I'd actually been offered an assistantship down there, but I had heard sort of unsettling things about it. So I decided that I'd stay at Rutgers. And 2 months almost to the date, he was killed in a car accident. Anderson was killed in a car accident. Oh. And his entire lab, just as you might imagine, just fell apart. And there was no opportunity to really stay at Rutgers at that point. So fortunately, the offer from the University of Central Florida was still on the table at that point. And so I was able to go ahead and take that offer and go down to Orlando and go down to a herp mecca and do my master's thesis down there on diamondback terrapins. Mm-hmm. And, that was a really, really horrible time for a lot of people, his family, obviously most, but all of his students. He had a terrific lab. He had a number of people in that lab that went on to have stellar careers. Mike Ryan from University of Texas was in that lab. Mary Mendonça, who's now at Auburn, was in that lab. We were all, Mary and I were undergraduates together in that lab. We had just a terrific group of people. It was outstanding. It was one of the best groups I've ever been associated with. But then when he was unfortunately killed, he was 45. He was killed in a car accident, and that pretty much ended any chance of staying at Rutgers.
Oh, yeah, that's too bad. And then, so you went down to Central Florida. You've got this kind of, this one of these two mentors you had, just went, just a tragedy, and breaking up of this great group of people. So obviously you're going to Florida as someone who's interested in turtles or really most things in biology. Florida would be an interesting place. And But and diamondback terrapins are obviously a fascinating animal and a cool ecosystem. But how was that transition? Thinking that you were going to stay with this mentor and continue, but then kind of very abruptly needing to move. Was that difficult, or did you hit the ground running in Florida?
Well, difficult personally, very much so. I definitely came down there with a big chip on my shoulder. It was hard making that transition, but fortunately, again, had a very good mentor named Lou Earhart, who's very well known in sea
Mm-hmm.
turtle areas. He was not really interested in non-sea turtles, but he knew that the University of Central Florida at that time had a major grant. They had $1 million grant in 1976 dollars, so several $1 million today, to do baseline ecological studies of the Kennedy Space Center,
Oh,
which
okay.
is about 50 miles from Orlando. And basically, we had carte blanche to run around a 125,000 hectare study site that was completely protected from the public. And they wanted to do pretty broad studies. And so I got turned loose basically as the general herper to do turtles, snakes, whatever I wanted to do. And I didn't get a lot of guidance from Lou. He was really focused on his sea turtles, but I got terrific support to just do pretty much what I wanted and learned a lot of independence. And that's one of the big things that came out of that whole experience, was to be able to work very independently. It was a fascinating time. Anyone who's, if from the Northeast, who's plopped down into Central Florida, it's a big culture shock, in terms of just, the local environment. But, you go there having done a couple of years of research, thinking you understand how amphibians and reptiles work. You understand how they behave and how to sample them. And then you go to a place like Florida and you realize very quickly you don't know nearly as much as you thought you did,
Mhm.
and that things work very differently down there. And that took a while to realize that I didn't know as much as I thought I knew. But it was a great experience, 2.5 years working with diamondback terrapins. Dabbled a little bit in snakes. I was starting the snake interest even then. The first time I wrote an independent report to a federal agency, I wrote a report to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on impacts of road mortality on turtle and snake populations at the Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge.
Hmm.
And so some of the things that I'm working on even today, like road mortality impacts, that started very early in my career. I had that interest, seeing dozens of dead snakes on the road on a national wildlife refuge got me thinking about the juxtaposition of having public visitation to sites that had very high concentrations of animals. And the very reason that those places were interesting to people, because they had such a great biota, also created all these conflicts that were not easily dealt with. Even starting back then, I knew that that was going to be an interest.
Yeah. And more recently in your career, you've done a fair amount of work on gopher tortoises. Is that right? Was that kind of sparked way back then when you were in
Yep.
Florida? Or, okay, I was just curious because we
Yeah,
did.
they made the horrible mistake of giving me a field vehicle with free gas all the time that I wanted to spend, and a permit to do just about anything I wanted on, again, 125 acres, 125,000 hectares of totally protected land. And so for lunch, that's what I would do. I would go, I would set my traps for my diamondback terrapins. And then while I was waiting for the traps to work, I would go out and road cruise along the beach at the Kennedy Space Center, right past the launch gantries for the space shuttle. And that was one of the biggest concentrations of gopher tortoises that I'd ever seen. And so I started doing a mark recapture study on gopher tortoises in 1976 and 1977 that I was still doing in 2015. So
Wow.
got the beginnings of long-term research came out of that experience as well.
Yeah, oh, that's great. Okay, well, let's continue on kind of that career trajectory because we're still pretty early on. You finish your master's on terrapins, and what? How did you find that next step? You're going to go get a PhD. How did you get
Mhm.
into a PhD program? Where did you go? What's the story there?
Another great lesson is they'll come out of this is why you go to scientific meetings and why you present papers at scientific meetings, because I knew I wanted to work more broadly on reptiles. That was where my interests were. And while I was toying with the idea of snakes, it was still sort of general herpetology. And Henry Fitch at that time was, the ultimate person to work for. He was probably the best known American reptile ecologist. And he was at University of Kansas, which is, of course, a giant mecca for herpetology in those days, and of course still is. And I had written Henry, the typical what I call a ping letter. This is my name. This is what I'm interested in. Are you taking any graduate students for the fall of 1979? And in the meantime, that roughly that same period, a year before I was going to go to my PhD, we went to the first combined SSAR, Herp League, ASIH combined meetings in Tempe, Arizona. And I gave a paper on reproductive biology and life history patterns of diamondback terrapins. And what I didn't know is Henry Fitch was in the front row. And I gave a paper. I thought it went pretty well. Didn't think about it until I wrote Henry that fall. And I got a letter that was the most roller coaster letter you can possibly imagine when he wrote back to me. High, low, high. First line from Henry's letter is, "Dear Rich, thank you very much for your interest in my research lab. I remember attending your paper at the HERP meetings in Tempe, Arizona, and being very impressed with your work and your approach." And I'm like, oh my God, Henry Fitch knows who I am. Holy crap. I can't believe it. The next paragraph is, "Unfortunately, I'm retiring next year, and I really should not take on any further PhD students." I'm going, oh God, no. And the third paragraph is, "But I really enjoyed your work, and I think we could do a great project together. So I've made an exception, and I'd be willing to sponsor you as my PhD student." So high, low, high in 3 paragraphs of that letter. Yeah. And that year, my wife and I were taking a cross-country trip. I had finished up my master's at Central Florida. We took a cross-country trip, and we stopped in Lawrence on the way back, in Lawrence, Kansas, on the way back from the meetings, from our trip, and met Henry and his wife, Virginia, and just fell in love with them. They were just the best people I could even imagine. I don't know if you ever had the opportunity to meet Henry, but for a person
Never.
with his publication record and his impact in the field, he was one of the most unassuming, kind gentlemen I have ever met in my life. And he was just terrific. I mean, he just walked up to me, put out his hand, said, "Hi, Rich, I'm Henry Fitch." Never called him doctor the whole time, even though he was literally the god of American ecology, or herp ecology at the time. He did, unfortunately, I almost killed him on the first day. So that's, I don't know if you're ready for a quick story.
Please do. I got to hear this one.
So Henry was one of the first, if not the first, herpetologist who made extensive use of what we call cover boards. He called them shelters. So tin, wood cover boards, and he had hundreds of them scattered throughout what's called the Natural History Reservation, which is where he lived. And so he and I, of course, as part of the interview process, he said, "Let's go take a round of the cover boards." And so I was very excited by this. So I had my own snake hook with me. We went out, and probably the 4th or 5th board that we flipped was about 6 feet long. And Henry was standing to my right. I was standing on the left side of the board. And in front of Henry is a beautiful coiled, about 3.5-foot copperhead. First copperhead I've ever seen in the wild. In front of me are about 4 or 5 ringneck snakes. Ringneck snakes were very abundant at the reservation, and they would come in these clusters. And unfortunately, Henry looked in front of me and saw the ringneck snakes, and I looked in front of Henry and saw the copperhead. So he went for the ringneck snakes. I went for the copperhead. We hit each other, and I knocked him into the copperhead, which then proceeded to bite his boot. Ooh. And I'm sitting there yelling at Henry, "There's a copperhead." And he's going, "Rich, there's ringnecks." And I'm going, "Henry, there's a copperhead." And he's going, "Rich, there are ringnecks." And finally, I got his attention and pointed out that this copperhead was biting his boot, and venom is dripping down his boot. And all that's going through my mind is, new graduate student kills major professor on first day on job, film at 11. So fortunately, I caught the copperhead. He caught the ringneck snakes. Nobody got bitten. We were all happy, but that was a lot more excitement on your first day in your field with your major professor than one should have to go through.
That was great. And so how did it work in his lab? Some PhDs or any graduate program, you'll kind of come into an existing program, and you're focused on something that's kind of, heavily guided by the faculty advisor, and some advisors give you kind of broad, guardrails, if you will, to work within, and allow you to think and develop ideas. How did that play out there? Reptiles face many challenges, from habitat loss to climate change. As an example, turtles are the most threatened group of animals on the planet, with over 60% of species classified as endangered. The Orianne Society is working hard to secure a thriving future for these incredible animals. To engage in the critical work we're doing, explore our website at www.orianne.org. There you'll find in-depth insights into the science, conservation action, and communication initiatives we're undertaking. Visit us today.
Henry was very much into you do what you need to do, and if you need me, you know where I live and you know my phone number.
Okay.
And he was the ultimate in independent work. And some people thrived under that environment, and I certainly did. I loved it. And some of his students didn't do as well. But everyone who worked with Henry knew that. The famous story, you may know the name Mike Plummer, Michael V. Plummer, very well known for working on green snakes, as well as soft shells. Mike had been his immediate past PhD student working on herps. And at one point, Mike decided to see how long he could go without having contact with Henry, how long it would take Henry to reach out to him. 6 months later, Henry called the campus and said, "Is Mike Plummer still a graduate student there?" Because he hadn't heard from him in 6 months.
Wow.
So Henry was the absolute ultimate in independence and letting you go your own way. If you needed help, he was there. If you needed guidance, he was there. And he would give just brilliant guidance. And I took very heavy advantage of picking Henry's brains because, having not worked specifically on snakes, having him as your mentor and going out in the field with him was literally a like having an independent study class on a daily basis. He did have his own way of doing things. I remember taking him out in the field, and I was marking my study population of massasauga rattlesnakes. We didn't have pit tags, of course, in those days, so this was all scale clipping. And I remember capturing a massasauga in front of him and clipping the scales to get an individual mark. And Henry looked at it and he says, "Oh, so you don't want to identify this animal ever again?" Because I wasn't doing the marking properly. And that was Henry's very non-subtle way of telling me that I had screwed up. But he would show you then how to do it properly if you asked. If you didn't ask, you would assume that you had figured it out. So a lot of independence, but just a terrific mentor by example is the way that Henry did things. He led by example rather than telling you what to do. He would never give you assignments. He would never tell you what to do. He'd let you choose your own coursework. It was all done very independently. And for me at that point in my career, that was exactly what I needed.
So you focused on massasaugas, and was it a particular aspect of their biology or kind of a more overarching natural history type study? What was your PhD dissertation?
Well, my PhD actually wound up being on garter snakes.
Oh, okay.
It evolved like PhDs have a tendency to evolve. It was, again, one of those things where you learn by mistake. And it's something that I have, tried to convey to my own students. Is what I did, unfortunately, is at that point I had been doing research constantly since 1975. And this was the fall of 1979. So I've been doing research for over 4 years. And I was frankly very uncomfortable with not doing research. The concept of not doing something made me very uncomfortable. And I rushed into a project that I honestly shouldn't have done. Henry had suggested that a project on these very poorly known rattlesnakes would be a very good PhD. And it certainly sounded that way to me. And he suggested a study site. He had actually never been there himself, but he had heard good reports about it, and in northwestern Missouri. And we went there the first day. I caught 4 massasaugas in about an hour and was enthralled by the snake, was enthralled by the study site, and just basically started designing sort of a very broad population ecology, reproductive biology, conservation status project, which was great. It was a very good project, but honestly, it wasn't a good PhD project. It was a little bit too narrow for a PhD project. And so over the course of time, the project evolved to looking at resource partitioning and foraging ecology of garter snakes, because there were just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of garter snakes there too. But the initial project is something, the massasaugas were something I, again, wound up working on for the next 20 or 25 years. But I would have benefited very strongly by taking a semester off and sitting down and reading broadly and talking to some of the great faculty and PhD students at Kansas about what direction my field should go. And that's always, I always felt that was the biggest mistake I made in my career, was not stopping then and saying, okay, I've done an undergraduate research, published that. I've done master's research, I've published that. What should I be doing now? Where direction? What interests do I have? And so I didn't do that. And that was honestly a mistake. That was something I tried to teach my own students, was to take the time, even though you feel rushed and you may feel, that you don't have the time to think broadly about what you want to do, to sit and read the literature and talk to people about what direction to go. And so it worked out for me. It worked out fine. I got lots of publications and did lots of great, I think, work. But I wouldn't have done it that way if I was doing it again.
Mm-hmm. Well, so you finish your PhD in Kansas, and what I want to do is I want to touch on kind of different aspects of your research program as you were faculty, and we'll get into that. But like how, so we don't necessarily have to do it chronologically, but what's the rest of the story? Kind of the nutshell version of, so you finish your PhD, postdoc wise, and then places that you were faculty over the years. What was that timeline like? And then we'll get into some of the details.
Timeline worked out. Sure. Well, the broad timeline is that when I was finishing up my PhD, I had an opportunity to interview as a postdoc at Savannah River Ecology Lab with Whit Gibbons, the next line in the mentorship, and got that position in 1983. So finished up my PhD, spent 4 years at SREL, and then got my first assistant professor position at Southeast Louisiana University, a comprehensive university just north of New Orleans. I was there for 1987 to 2001. And 2001 parlayed some of my interests in being an administrator into being department chair at Towson University up in Maryland. And that's where I wound up retiring from. So it was Kansas to SREL to Southeast Louisiana to Towson University. That's sort of the quick timeline of how it worked. There's a lot of things that went on there, but that's the quick timeline.
Yeah. And so you've had an interesting career in that, you talk about, you've moved around the country, but, you have projects that you worked on, even though you weren't in Florida for quite some time. You had massasauga projects that went on for quite some time, even though you may not have always been living in those areas. So what I'm going to ask you in a minute, so you can just put this in the back of your head, is like how to best categorize some of the big components of your research program over time, and then we'll dive into some of those. But before that, I do want to talk about these books that I mentioned, in particular I'll just call them the snake books, and they're very influential to me. And the latest one, I was lucky to work with my former advisor on one of the chapters, and but I'm just curious, how did that all come about? How did you, because you played a major role, how did that come about? And maybe kind of tell us that story before we dive into kind of components of your long-term research program.
Again, a lot of it comes from mentorship. At Kansas, I was very lucky to form a good personal relationship with Joseph Collins. Everyone knows, of course, Collins from the Herp Field Guides. And Joe at that time was the curator of ichthyology at the museum and herpetology at the Museum of Natural History, which is where I was based at Kansas. And Joe and I had a lot of conversations about things. One of the first ones was that since Henry Fitch was retiring, we wanted to do a volume celebrating his career, what's called a Festschrift volume. And very early in my time at Kansas, we put together a symposium honoring Henry at the SSAR meetings in Milwaukee. And that turned into my first published book, was an edited volume honoring Henry in terms of his approach to doing reptile ecology and herp ecology. And that got me interested in publishing books, not just in publishing original research papers. And then Joe and I had a number of conversations about snakes, and that there had been a very influential book on turtles called Turtles, Perspectives and Ecology. And it was published, I think, in 1979. And having to do all of the pulling together of the scientific literature on snake ecology for my PhD, I knew what kind of challenge that was. And I knew how valuable, as working on turtles, this book on turtles, perspectives, and research had been. And there was just an obvious market for doing something similar on snakes. And so when I went to SREL and I mentioned this to Whit Gibbons, he was very encouraging to make that part of my postdoc responsibilities. And so I contacted Joe, and Joe and I started working on it. And through a series of efforts, finally got a good book publisher and pulled together a very, very good set of authors, and that's what led to the first book on snake biology. And it was a combination of knowing the right people, being in the right place, and then, of course, seeing the need, because that was always one of the big things. Is I became pretty much an evangelist for snakes, having worked on snakes starting for my PhD. And I knew that there were a lot of barriers to working on snakes, as you, of course, are familiar with, not just, what people think about them, but even what professionals think about them. And the easier you can make that entry into working on snakes, the better the chance that we're going to be able to attract really high quality students into the field. And so that was the idea of all of those books, was to inspire people to do better and more research on snakes by making the entry point into doing research on snakes that much easier, not having to spend hundreds of hours pulling together the literature, but being able to put the literature in one place and the things that were important to do in the next big steps in research. So a lot of that came from working with Joe. A lot of it came from working with Whit. A lot of it came from working with Henry. So all of those mentors played a big role in that.
Yeah, that's great. Well, before we get into this, kind of your life work research wise, and like I said, how you might categorize that and the best way to discuss it. I made the statement that, there's some projects that you've worked on, over long periods of time, independent of where you physically were. And I'm just curious if you could just speak to that for a second, like how much, so you were in Kansas and then South Carolina and Louisiana and then up to Maryland. How much did, your physical location play a role in the development of research programs where you were versus kind of these more long-term projects that maybe you had some involvement with, at past times during your career?
Well, I think that by the time I got to Kansas and finally had a chance to really sit down and think about things, and particularly working with Henry Fitch, I knew that the two big themes of my research were going to be, one, conservation, particularly of snakes and turtles, and secondly, the recognition from, again, working with people who had long-term research problems, particularly Henry and Whit Gibbons, that you're not going to understand the conservation biology and the population ecology of turtles and snakes unless you have a long-term perspective. You can get useful data out of a master's thesis. You can get useful data out of a PhD dissertation. But if you're really going to understand how these populations are operating, whether they're declining, if they're increasing, why are they increasing? Why are they declining? What is the root causes of their status, that you have to have a long-term perspective. You can't do these things in snapshots. The snapshots provide just that. They just provide a snapshot. And so I realized that because of the nature of academia, I was not ever going to be in one place that long. And so I had two choices. One is to only ever do snapshots, or the other one was to say, I don't care that I'm now in Louisiana. We have such a thing called airplanes, and you can get on an airplane, and if you can get grant support, you can still go do research in Missouri. And you form collaborations with people who are in the area and students who are in the area, and you find imaginative ways to continue to do long-term research even though, unlike Henry, who lived on his study site for 50 years, you don't have that advantage. You can still do that. And if you're committed to that philosophically, that that's what you need to be able to do, you find ways to do it. It's not always easy, and it's not always as simple as it would be if you just did studies in your local area. But it's certainly feasible, and it certainly does make a difference if you've got that long-term perspective. So even by the time I left Kansas, I knew that I was going to be doing long-term research and made that a point of emphasis. And in fact, one of the first things I did when I got to Southeast Louisiana was contact the folks down at the Kennedy Space Center and see if they were interested in my coming back and doing follow-up studies on diamondback terrapins. And what I found is exactly what I was afraid of, that once I had left in 1979, no one had followed up on the research there on terrapins for 12 years. And so there was this unfortunate, as it turned out, very important 12-year gap in the
Yeah.
research. And by the time I got back down to the Kennedy Space Center, the terrapin populations had disappeared. They were gone.
Yeah.
Populations of terrapins that were phenomenally abundant were no longer there. And that told me that this is why you can't do episodic snapshots. You need that long-term perspective, because we'll never understand what happened to those terrapin populations and why they so severely crashed. If someone had been there, we might have had a better understanding of that. And that was a real driving force to me to say, no, you need to foster these long-term studies.
Yeah. Hey, so you're moving around physically in different parts of the country, but you're maintaining some long-term projects. How did you, when you were working with grad students, given that framework, but a lot of grad projects are going to kind of be snapshots, or you could embed them, say, within a bigger long-term program you might have on terrapins or gopher tortoises or massasaugas or whatever it might be, and have them kind of all answer pieces of a bigger thing that you're putting together. I guess basically, did you take the Fitch approach and have students kind of working locally on a variety of things, or were you plugging students into some of these long-term projects that you were working on?
Both. I mean, again, because of the influence of Henry, I would never assign a student to a project. I would tell a student what the opportunities were. So if a student came down to interview in Louisiana, I would say, here are some possibilities. We have a long-term project relatively locally on gopher frogs. We could fit you in there. I have a long-term project on gopher tortoises and snake populations at the Kennedy Space Center. I've got a long-term project on snake populations at Northwest Missouri. Here is some background about this. When you come down to interview, let's discuss which one of these you feel you would be best suited to do. And then the student and I would sit there and go over the possibilities, and the student would decide which area they were most interested in. And I would point out that there would always be differences in support level. So, for example, if you wanted to work locally in Louisiana on gopher frogs, that was going to be the best supported project, and you wouldn't have to leave home. You wouldn't have to worry about being gone for the summer. But if you wanted to go out and do something on massasaugas in Missouri, that we could arrange that as well. And so it was always the student's decision, but it had to be an informed decision. But I never felt comfortable, and it pretty much came from my experience at Kansas. I never felt comfortable plugging a student in. It was more of the student's interest combined with what was available at the time. And most of the time, that was very successful. Not always. There are times that worked better than others. But generally, having that student decide what they wanted to do and therefore engaging them in the ownership of the project, that was very important to how we managed to pull that off.
Great. Well, so I asked you about categorizing your research program. So you've mentioned things such as, the importance of long-term studies. You've mentioned particular places or species. You've talked about grad students. How do you, looking back on your research career, I mean, you also mentioned conservation was one of the big wings of your work. How do you, in your mind, how would you categorize your research program over time? If you enjoy listening to the Snake Talk podcast, stay in the loop with the Orianne Society's latest conservation updates from the field. Read about new published research, as well as fascinating insights on the species we work with by following us on social media. Follow, like, share. Let's spread the word. Together, we can make a difference. Find the Orianne Society on Instagram, Facebook, X, or LinkedIn and be part of the conversation.
So I always describe myself as a population ecologist and life history ecologist who's interested in using information from population ecology and life history ecology to inform decisions on conservation and management. That's the 20-second soundbite, which everybody, by the way, if your listeners knows you need to have. But that was it. I had two really basic, strong interests. One was in population ecology, broadly speaking, including life history. And that, of course, was a lot of the research that I did on snakes with Neil Ford, which we haven't talked about yet. A lot of the research that I did with Neil Ford on sort of basic evolutionary life history, processes, that was all that axis of it. And then conservation biology being the other, but the two interact with each other. You cannot understand, I've never felt you could understand the conservation and management of reptiles and amphibians without a firm grasp of population biology. And at the same time, I feel that being a pure population biologist who's unconcerned about the conservation and status of the organisms you work with is not something that I felt comfortable with. I felt that those two things always had to go together. So I always felt there was a very strong interaction between those two branches of my research program. I mean, some of the papers I published with Neil Ford have nothing to do with conservation except in the very broadest sense. But that was always in the back of my mind because even when I was studying, checkered garter snakes to look at phenotypic plasticity, we were also looking at their population status in the wild because you can do both at once. And that's something, again, that came out of working with both people like Henry Fitch and with Whit Gibbons, was being able to do two things at once with the same project.
Yeah. Well, if we had to pick kind of one area, because we don't have time to go through all of these different kind of long-term projects, if we were going to dive in a little bit deeper on one of them, I mean, do you have one in particular you'd like to talk about? I mean, would you like to talk about, the life history related work with Neil or massasaugas, or what do you think would be the most interesting to talk about in a little more depth?
I think probably the massasaugas, because there were so many aspects to it, both in terms of just a very interesting species, but also in terms of the sort of different areas that it got us into politics, both on the conservation level and on the biological level, how management works in the real world. That was a very strong lesson that came out of working with a rattlesnake, working with state and federal agencies and all of the intricacies of doing that and pulling that together, working with the public on an animal that people don't particularly care for, as you know. I think that was probably the most interesting. It's hard to pick one, but that would be the one. If I was going to pick one, I guess I'd pick that one.
Yeah. So if we pick that up, so correct me if I'm wrong, but you started during your time when you're starting your PhD, you started marking massasaugas and you ended up transitioning to garter snakes. Was the populations that you were marking during the PhD, are these the Northwest Missouri populations that you ended up working on over the long term, or did you shift sites?
Correct. No, well, I added sites. I didn't shift sites. When I first started working on massasaugas, again, I got very lucky because they were a state-listed species as endangered. And Tom Johnson, who you may know that name, he was, of course, the illustrator on the Conant and Collins's field guides. Tom Johnson was the state herpetologist, and he was very supportive of doing work on massasaugas. Even then, there was growing recognition, even in the late 70s, early 80s, that massasaugas were in deep trouble range-wide, and particularly from Missouri and the Midwest on east, that there were, real significant declines because of the loss of prairie habitats. And so in Missouri at that time, there was only one known population, and that was the one I worked with in Northwest Missouri. Eventually, we found two others in central Missouri, but that came later. And so Tom was very supportive. And so I got not a big grant, but I got sort of continuing moderate level support to work on massasaugas. So I was doing the classic, Whit Gibbons, Henry Fitch approach. I was doing funded research on massasaugas on the right hand, and on the left hand, I was studying garter snake foraging ecology. And again, since you're at the same site, you can do both at once. But the Massasauga work was the one that, in terms of conservation, that was my first real exposure to management, state agencies, federal agencies, the interaction between the two of them, listing, state listings, federal listings, all of that came out of that work on Massasaugas up in Northwest Missouri.
So you're doing a long-term mark recapture, and I'm assuming examining all aspects of the population. So was the information you were collecting, all of this population data, I'm assuming, was that information really critical for some of these more management decisions, where the agencies, taking the information that you had gathered and incorporating that into, say either federal or state level conservation and management?
Well, that was the intent. And again, one of the lessons quickly came that you can have an obvious biological conclusion that doesn't result in any management action, because as a biologist, you don't make the management decisions. You make the management recommendations. And so, for example, one of the most important things that came out of the work on Massasaugas was that there was a central prairie in the middle of the refuge, and it's surrounded by a tour loop road. And each year, a substantial fraction of the Massasauga populations would move across that road into the surrounding habitats, presumably for foraging. We never pinned that down, but that was presumably why they did it. We confirmed that through telemetry, confirmed that through mark recapture. And particularly in the fall, the snakes would be very conspicuously present on the roads, all heading back into the central prairie. The problem is that the refuge, which didn't get a lot of visitation in the spring and the summer, in the fall, they got mass migrations of snow geese. And it was the largest concentrations of snow geese in the entire Midwest region. And so on days, particularly weekends, where the weather was nice, we would get what was literally bumper to bumper traffic. And I'm not exaggerating here, bumper to bumper traffic on the Tour Loop Road, where the people would get a good view of the snow geese and also be the same place where the Massasaugas were crossing the road to get back into the prairie. And so there was literal carnage of Massasaugas on the road. I would be on the road with myself, usually my wife, sometimes volunteers. We would have some people walk the road. We would try to stop the cars from running over the snakes. It didn't really help. I tried to get, again, making the obvious management recommendation that the loop road needed to be closed to visitors from basically September 15th to the early part of November to prevent Massasauga road mortality. And the refuge biologist, who generally was pretty sympathetic, the refuge manager was generally pretty sympathetic to snakes. And he had allowed me to stay on the refuge. He didn't provide any financial support, but he gave me a place to stay and, allowed me, access to all parts of the refuge that the public couldn't have access. He told me that if he tried to close the refuge roads for a rattlesnake, he'd be fired the next day. And so my first real collision with, here's a very obvious management conclusion from my research, that the snakes, because of their movement patterns, are highly vulnerable to road mortality in the fall, ran smack into political reality, which is that that's not going to happen. And these were way before anyone even thought about road culverts or road overpasses, which probably wouldn't have been feasible anyway. But it was well before anyone thought about those ideas. And so I would get 50, 60, 70% of my fall sample would be dead snakes and dead gravid females. And that was one of the lessons, is how do you handle that? It gets very tempting at that point to simply become an evolutionary ecologist and study phenotypic plasticity of snakes in the lab, because you don't have to worry about anybody coming in and killing your animals. And how you handle that. And one of the things I always told my students is that when you're picking that project, if you're going to pick snake conservation in particular, but any herp conservation, you're going to lose far more battles than you're going to win. And you're going to have to be satisfied with fighting the good fight and doing the right thing rather than having the outcome that you want, because the political reality is that that often does not happen.
And that was assuming prior to any federal listing. Did anything change at those sites post listing?
Well, of course, we had the species got split, and this is an example of federal politics. Series of very well-respected population geneticists came in and split massasaugas into two species, and the populations in Missouri were Cisturis tergeminus now, the western massasauga, which is not in fact listed. The eastern massasauga, Cisturis capnatus, is what's listed. It wouldn't make any difference. I don't know if you've ever talked to Mike Dreslick in Illinois Natural History. Yeah. Okay. Well, Drez has been working on massasaugas, eastern massasaugas at Lake Carlisle in Illinois. And one of his biggest threats is road mortality from people visiting his study site on the weekend. And those populations have been federally listed for almost 10 years now. There's no change in protection. It has not made any change in protection. That's another lesson to learn, is that, well, we all look at endangered species protection as some type of panacea. The reality is, again, if you want to work in, my lesson is, you want to work in herp conservation, it's not the laws and the regulations that are the key. It's who you know and how well you can influence them. Because you can get a lot of changes done on a very local level, even if the regulations don't necessarily support it, simply by convincing people that this is an appropriate approach. So it wouldn't have made any difference. But in this case, the road mortality has been going on for decades. It's still going on, and has had major impacts on the population. The population is definitely took a downturn as a result of road mortality. But there are a lot of other things, again, that long-term perspective gave us, particularly the gigantic floods in the Midwest in the early 1990s, which if I had just left that population, we never would have known what kind of devastation and what kind of recovery patterns those snake populations had after the giant Midwest flood of 1993.
Well, last thing about this, and then we'll. There's one more thing I want to ask you about before we begin to wrap up. But so you talked a lot about kind of the applied side of things, but you hinted at the idea that you found some other sites in the state, and that you've been studying these animals for a long time, and you talked about phenotypic plasticity. What were some of the interesting aspects of this animal's biology that you learned over the the long term working with these populations?
Well, I think that, again, this is something that I think anyone who works long-term with the reptiles knows, and that's two things. Number one, the anytime you think you understand what the animal is doing, they'll surprise you. If you think you understand their reproductive patterns, they'll do something different. If you think you understand their foraging patterns, they'll do something different. So again, just the fact that something that you've studied for a long time will continue to surprise you the longer you study it. But again, it was such a, working on a rattlesnake is not something that most people think of as being a very smart thing to do. And yet this was one of the most innocuous, calm snakes I've ever worked with. Anytime I ever had any issues with, almost getting bit by this rattlesnake was always my own fault. And, how well you can coexist with these snakes. That you would go out in the field with people and tell them that you were working on massasaugas, and they would tell you that there are no massasaugas there. And then you would say, well, what about the one 3 feet from your left foot? And you realize just how well these snakes could coexist with people over time if they were just allowed to. Those are some of the things that I really enjoyed from doing that study.
Great. Well, let's transition. Last thing I want to talk about, and then we'll take this episode in for a landing. But so you mentioned you made the move, I believe, in the early 2000s up to Maryland, and you shifted to more of an administrative role, being the department head. And I can't remember, but I want to say you had other administrative roles up there as well.
No,
but
department head was
but just kind of curious about, what kind of prompted that decision, from a work perspective. And then, how was that transition for you? Were you still able to do a fair amount of research? Were you at a point in your career where you were less interested in focusing on research? Just talk a little bit about that transition to administration, if you would.
Well, in an academic environment, you begin to realize, just like in any environment, that, the people you work with and the people who manage you are tremendously important to your day to day ability to be happy in your job, to have satisfaction in your job. And I actually learned and got interested in doing department administration when I was back at Rutgers, believe it or not. Our department chair was a guy named Dan Wilhoft, and Dan was actually Jim Anderson's long-term partner. They had gone to graduate school together, and all I knew about Dan as I started getting into research was his fact that he was a very, very good and very responsive department chair, but he also would come with us on field trips, and was very surprised by this. You don't really see your department chair out there wading in a pond, dragging a seine. That's not typical. And so we were sitting around a campfire one night. We were on a field trip to South Carolina. We sat around, and I finally said, Dan, I've got to know, um, you obviously love this stuff. I've looked up your research record. You've published in Science. You've published in Nature. Why are you the department chair? Why aren't you out here doing this all the time? And he says, if the people who are no good at teaching and are no good at research become the department chairs, because the people who are good at research and good at teaching only want to do research, who is going to be representing you in the administration? Who is going to be leading you? They're going to be the people who can't do what you do. And that had a big impact on me, even though I was just a junior at that time. That had a big impact on me, that particular moment. And I realized at some point in your career, you need to transition, not move away from, but transition more of the emphasis towards, if you've got the talent and you've got the interest for doing it, then moving into sort of a leadership role and helping facilitate other people to do what you've done is a responsibility. And it's a responsibility that, again, not everyone wants to do it. Not everyone has the personality traits to do it. But if you do, and you have that interest, then it's somewhat incumbent upon you to sort of give back what you got from good leadership when you were at early stages of your career. And I decided pretty early on that that was something that I was A, good at, and B, wanted to do. And so for personal reasons, we wanted to be back up. Family reasons, we wanted to be back up in the Mid-Atlantic Northeast region. And so when the opportunity at Towson came across, we had, two herpetologists in the department. We had Don Forrester and Joel Snodgrass were both in the department. You had an amphibian biologist and a landscape ecologist, both in the department, and both work with herps. So it was a good place to be. Not the snakiest place to be, unfortunately, but it was a good place for turtles. It was a good place for a lot of other things. It was a good research environment. And it was a good chance for me to sort of exercise that part of what I felt was my professional responsibility. So when I had that opportunity, I took it, and I think it's worked out well. It's definitely reduced my level of research, particularly on snakes, because the area, you don't get to travel as much as a department chair. That's a lot harder to do. But I kept up my research in Florida for over a decade. I kept up the research for massasaugas for another 7 or 8 years, even after I moved out here, and still managed to be productive in terms of research. So you can in fact do both. And I think that I got a lot of satisfaction from doing it, from doing both. So I'm very happy that I did that.
Yeah, great. Well, I think you've heard some episodes, so you knew this is coming, but I like to have each of my guests tell me their best snake story. So do you have a snake story for us?
I have many snake stories for you. I'll tell one that will be a good Whit Gibbon story as well, but it's also a good snake story and a lesson. So we had gone to, when I was first starting my postdoc at Savannah River Ecology Lab, we went out to Kiowa Island, and my first trip out there. And we had gone out and we had sampled, this was in January or February, but it was still pretty warm. And we'd gone out and sampled some ponds for turtles. And we were all getting together for dinner. So we were all relatively dressed up, and we were congregating in front of the house that we were staying in. It was just getting dusk. It was just getting dark. And, like any good snake biologist, even though I had done turtles, I was, poking around looking for snakes. And sure enough, what I thought was a corn snake came crawling out from underneath one of the palmettos. And so I realized I didn't have a light. I didn't have a hook. I better check on this. I said, "Hey, Whit, there any venomous snakes on the island?" He went, "No, nothing to worry about." So I planted my foot on the cord snake, reached down to pick it up. And he said, "Except copperheads." And yes, just as you would expect, I had planted my foot right on the back of a copperhead, which for whatever reason decided to sit there and go, "Oh God, another one of these dumbass Gibbon students." And didn't bite me, didn't even attempt to bite me, even though I was just wearing sneakers. And so I mentioned to Whit very politely that perhaps he should tell people the first question that, are there any venomous snakes? But that's one of my favorite, the combination of a snake story and a Whit Gibbon story.
Copperheads play prominent in your history. So
Copperheads are, copperheads are great. I'm glad I got to work with copperheads a little bit. I always wanted to do a detailed study on copperheads and never had the chance. So something I may do in retirement is try to find a good copperhead population to work with. I really do like copperheads.
There you go. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It's good to talk to you and good to really learn a lot more about your career. And I think the audience will be interested just like I was. So thanks again.
Yep. My pleasure. Have fun. I appreciate the invitation.
Great. And I just wanted to thank the audience and tell everybody to remember snakes are animals too. And it's a privilege to see one in the wild.